and welcome to the Accountability Game, streamlining data privacy across APAC and the globe. If you're joining us live, our speakers are now in session answering your questions. For audio-video issues, please click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Jason Lau and Rob Rowe for the presentation.
Thanks very much, and welcome everyone to what I hope is going to be an interesting conversation between myself. I'm Rob Rowe, I'm the Managing Director for OneTrust for Asia Pacific. Jason, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jason Lau. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Crypto.com, which is a fintech organization, amongst other things. And I'm pleased to be here with Rob today to talk to you about privacy and security in the region.
Thanks, Jason. Let's go to the agenda. We're going to talk about just a couple of slides on regulation being the new growth industry. And then I'm going to interview Jason as we go through streamlining data privacy and what they've done around implementing ISO 27701. Jason's in the trenches having to make this happen all the time. And then I'll come back and talk about a bit about a guide to getting you to certification on 27701. So starting off with the growth industry, we've got right across Asia, actually across the globe, but here in Asia, we've got all these different privacy standards. Look, we've put PDPA up there, but it's PDPA Thailand, PDPA Philippines, PDPA Indonesia. We're seeing PDPB in India. And what we're also seeing is I list out some of these requirements is we're actually seeing changes to that. Singapore are actually going out to consultation now. Indonesia is about to pass new laws. Japan's just added a new annexure around consent, and we're going to see some more action there. India's going through the release of their PDPB. New Zealand government is at the final stages of their Privacy Act. So we're sitting here with massive change going on all across Asia in the midst of a pandemic and everything else. So what else could go wrong here in 2020? So with all of that, and we've got to worry about ISO 27001, NIST for security. We're seeing more cyber attacks. We've got a lot happening in this space. So I think it's great, Jason, that we have here for you to share us your journey, and talk about crypto and what crypto is doing in this space, because you're right across some of these challenges right now. Let me hand over to you, Jason.
Absolutely. So thanks very much. So I think, Rob, what you've done is a great setup for the presentation today. Absolutely, there's so many regulations around the world, and obviously many of these regulations in Asia Pacific are started by looking at the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe as the foundation. Now, we're going to be seeing a lot more of these changes in the region for sure, and I think one of the biggest challenges is how do organizations navigate this? How do we what's the privacy strategy? What's a cross-border data transfer strategy? And unfortunately, it's very difficult to have a strategy for each and every one of the regions. So what we did in our organization, my role is the basically the security and privacy global strategy and implementation. So what we did was, rather than focus into any one particular regulation, we decided that we would be using more of an overall privacy governance type of model. Now, the benefit of this is if we were to use some sort of framework, whether it's NIST or ISO, this would allow us to more readily operationalize privacy. And then when we go to the different regions, we will be able to pivot and then make the requirements more localized, if you want to put it that way. Now, the challenge is we actually started last year. And at that time, ISO 27701 was actually not officially out yet. The NIST privacy framework only came out in January this year. So we kind of had an idea of what was coming. And one of the key things to understand is that it's really bringing together security and privacy. So security is more concerned with what we call the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But privacy, for many organizations, is still quite new. And it's more about upholding the rights and respecting the rights of individuals, both internally in your organization and also externally. And how do we actually bring that all together? So one of the challenges that we will actually see is one of the requirements first is having ISO 27001. So if you don't have ISO 27001, you won't be able to bridge to the new 27701. I think there's a brief typo on the top of the line at the top. It should be saying 27701. But one of the key important aspects of this is to have your information security management system in place, which focuses more on your policies and procedures and security controls. Then after that, then you can bridge that and take that to the next step to cover for privacy. Now,
sorry.
Yeah, sure.
Jason, can I just ask a question there? You know,
Absolutely.
this difference between security and privacy, right? You said people are new to this whole privacy space. How have you found that in crypto, getting the understanding that it's not just keeping data secure, you got to be collecting the right sort of data for the right purpose in the first place for people's privacy. So how have you gone on that journey between, you know, your slide before this one, security and privacy?
Sure. So that's a good question. So it starts really at the top. So from a cultural perspective and also from a management perspective, we have to tell people that, look, we're working towards this new certification, and part of this is implementing new controls in place. And part of that, for example, is a privacy information management system. And a sub part of that would be to implement things like a privacy impact assessment. So early on we always say the catchphrase, rather than kind of bake it in at the end, we have to, bolt it on at the end, we have to bake it in at the very beginning. So during the product life cycle, so we're a very product-centric company. So at the very beginning, we have to do a privacy impact assessment, security impact assessment during the design phase. That's when we actually can decide, look, from a risk-based approach, are we actually over-collecting data? Should we be collecting this type of data in the first place? So we use standards such as this ISO standard to help us to operationalize what we actually need to achieve.
So real privacy by design stuff up front.
That's right, right up front. And you can see from this particular slide, it's basically how you actually operationalize and jump from the old ISO to the new ISO.
Cool. Thanks for that, Jason. Yep. So if I can go back, if we just go back your slide here, how long did it take you to do the ISO 27001, the security standard first? What were the challenges around that?
Sure, that took us about, I would say, 8 to 9 months, but it really depends on the size of the organization, the different regions that you operate in, and also the staff that you have on hand. Something like this is really challenging if you don't have the right people to help you to drive the policies and procedures. So having it all in writing is one thing, but actually implementing the security controls to actually address the procedures and policies that need to be put in place is often the challenge for many companies.
So to this audience that we have here today, I mean, they'd be very familiar with ISO 27001 or a NIST or a CSA and stuff like that. I don't imagine they're that familiar with 27701, the privacy standard that sits on top of that. How did you go about introducing that to crypto in the first place?
So part of what we do is we sit in a very interesting market where a lot of countries still haven't regulated the digital money space or the fintech crypto space yet. So part of doing this from the executive perspective is we want to build trust with our employees and also trust with our customers. Now, how do we build trust? Well, we build trust from ensuring that the core pillars of security and privacy are really at the forefront of what we're trying to achieve. So any product that we build, anything or service that we provide, security and privacy really need to be the cornerstone. Now, from the security perspective, it's not just the ISO 27001. We also have PCI Level 1 compliance at the highest level. And from the privacy perspective, because I'm also the regional lead for the International Association of Privacy Professionals, I've always been advocating for privacy very heavily within the organization. So when this certification came out, it was actually a very good stepping stone to achieve many of the goals we need to achieve with the General Data Protection Regulation as well. So there's not a direct one-to-one mapping with achieving all of the articles within the GDPR and 27701, but there's a lot of nice overlap where 27701 can help you to operationalize some of the goals you want to achieve within the GDPR.
And you mentioned before that the standard is actually a privacy information management system. It's sort of like, not like, hey, I'm complying to some regulation or some checklist. I'm actually building a privacy information management system. So
that's correct.
From that, do you want to explain that to the audience a bit and how that differs from the individual regulations?
So again, it goes back to the operationalizing of privacy. So you would first need to make sure that you have a privacy information management system scope. With all of these ISOs, you can generally decide the scope. So sometimes they would just decide that, look, we just want to do this ISO certification for a particular department or a data center or marketing or customer service. For us, it was different. I really look at security and privacy as a holistic perspective. So our scope was really an enterprise-wide scope. So our audit was really across the board for all of the departments. Then once you've got your PIMS kind of scope set up, you need to have management buy-in and set up your privacy policy and your privacy notice, and then really look at privacy from a risk perspective. So when you look at privacy from a risk perspective, there are many different risk management models in the industry. You can really choose whichever type you want. But one way would be to understand all of the different assets that you have in your organization, then categorize those based on risk, and then what type of security and privacy controls do you have around that, for example. Then the next step would be to build, like we discussed before, really comprehensive privacy impact assessments. Once you've got the privacy impact assessment, then you can actually take that to the different teams who may not necessarily know too much about privacy, but with this checklist, you'll be able to make it really quick and simple for them so that when they do their QA of any product or any new project that they start with, they have a very systematic process of going through a checklist. Am I collecting PII data? What type of PII data? Is it sensitive PII data? Do I really need this PII data? What are the retention periods? How long are we going to keep it for, et cetera, et cetera? So then there's a lot of different controls and security controls that need to go into place to actually make sure that we address those privacy concerns. Then there's all sorts of things you got to worry about, from controllers and processor agreements. These are the things that were not in the original ISO 27001. So these new processor agreements, controller agreements, how to handle these areas and covering these areas are very new to many in the security field.
And you operate across different countries, different jurisdictions. How has this helped you with, what I put up at the start, with all these regulations, but also the changes of that? So what's the kind of value this has brought to you and to crypto?
Sure. So I think really standardizing this is useful. So using a perfect example of a privacy notice, which is customer facing. We started ours based on the GDPR, and we obviously use the ISO 27001 when we operationalize it. If we can customize that and pivot for the different regions that we operate in, then it makes things a lot easier. Same thing for cookie consent policies. Same thing for our privacy impact assessments. Every region, if you go to the local regulator or their website, they probably do have a template or something that they can share with you in order to actually do your privacy impact assessment. But standardizing that across the board, regardless of your region, makes things significantly easier to manage and to maintain.
Yeah,
there's many more examples, but yeah, those are two.
Yeah. We're also seeing a challenge around privacy notices, etc., across different platforms, right? So your website, your mobile app, transaction systems and all that sort of stuff. And we're seeing our customers have those challenges. So and moving through that. You mentioned at the start also about cross-border transfers. How are you handling that? You know, we see that the privacy commissioners are wanting to use that APEC cross-border privacy regulations. What are you doing? How it's helping you?
So this is not really within the scope of the ISO, but it's still definitely something that we're working on, and it's an ongoing project that we're working on because many of, as you mentioned, many of the local Asia Pacific regulators are really pushing for this. It is useful, but going back to the original GDPR, having binding contracts between the entities that we work with and even within our own global organization is a really good way to make sure that there are contractual and legal binding agreements between everybody on how data is transferred. I think it's still a little bit early. We're watching it very carefully on the Asia Pacific side of things, and it's definitely useful for open transfers, but I think it's still quite early in the stage at the moment. So for us, we're using a lot of the more the GDPR type of guidance.
Yeah, I can hear that in the language that you're talking about. Also, we're seeing it's shaping up versus some of the APEC type stuff they're trying to do versus standards like 27701, so that if I can comply with that within regions, then I can try to get adequacy. And we know that at the moment the EU hasn't given this their tick of approval under their article, so we'll see how that all plays out.
That's right.
Whether there's adequacy and stuff like that. Moving along then to, okay, well, how do you do this? And some experiences that we have found out there in implementing this with customers is that when we talk to a whole lot of customers, we find that they rely on this tool that you may or may not have heard of. It's a thing called Excel, and everyone's putting everything into spreadsheets, and they're using email as this workflow running around, and it all drops into this document. And this makes it actually very hard to be agile. And then when we look at all the different environments, so Jason talked about the security realm, ISO 27001. We now have the privacy realm. We, of course, have vendor risk management, and we have risk and compliance, which risk right now is, especially around, well, how do we plan for a risk around a pandemic, and what's the next things that we'll need to worry about? And the other thing that we're finding is that there's a lot of information sharing around this. So, under GDPR that we mentioned, you actually, need to make sure you have confidentiality, integrity, availability. They've added resilience in that security point as well. We're seeing in Australia, we're seeing the financial sector regulator, APRA, implement a thing called CPS 234. So by the end of this month, the financial institutes here have to have a full vendor risk management process in place. By the way, that's linking into security, it's linking into privacy, it's linking into risk and compliance. So we can see this whole connection coming left, right and centre. And what we see is individual departments all trying to solve their Rubik's Cube, whether that's consent, purpose, confidentiality, integrity, solvency, et cetera, going forward. And when we're working with customers, what we try to do is pull it back out of that, and we say, start thinking about it from this realm. At the start of everything, it's about a process. I mean, we're not buying a system just because we want to buy a system. We're buying it to do something for us. So we have all these processes that customer service or sales or marketing, et cetera, that we're doing. And from those processes, we're collecting information. That information could be personal data, it could be organizational data. And we have these sorts of questions. Do we have consent? What's our purpose? The point Jason's making, are we collecting too much? So concepts like data minimization. And then we're going to store that data somewhere. So we're going to have these internal systems. Where are they located? Are they safe? Who has access? But by the way, especially the rapid digitization we're seeing happening, that's now going into these third-party systems that we're using. So cloud-based systems, SaaS, et cetera, et cetera. And then we've got to worry about the vendors themselves. So we're seeing a lot more companies now doing assessments out to COVID-19 assessments. How solvent are you? And we have a lot of customers in the travel industry who have been hit very, very hard in this whole space. So what we're seeing is this data flowing from the top, from the processes. We're collecting it all the way down through our internal and our third-party systems and our vendors. And, of course, you can have fourth-party systems. So what are your vendors relying on, and how do we go through that? And this becomes the challenge of trying to pull all of this together in the space. So I think one of the reasons why we, it was great to have Jason talk about his journey at crypto and using a privacy information management system like ISO 27701, which covers ISO 27001, is we're covering all these spaces. And the way that we look at this is we kind of, remember those Rubik's Cubes I showed you before? We kind of think of it as like this Rubik's Cube that looks like this. I don't think that could possibly work, but if we could have this multifaceted Rubik's Cube, because we now have all this knowledge about what's going on inside our organization, and in that, what we can do is we can point to, well, I want to look at this from a privacy perspective. I want to look at this from a security perspective, from a GRC or from a vendor management perspective. And this is what we work with a lot of customers, and we're doing a lot of work around the 27701 on top of 27001, because it's about, what you talked about before, Jason, is working with the business, working with the organization, understanding what data are we collecting, are we collecting it for all the right reasons, where are we storing it, what controls, what risks, what threats, vulnerabilities do we have in that place. And as I showed you before with those lines going everywhere, we need to understand how all these different things are connected. And I think that's part of the challenge, Jason, that you've had to face and where you've come out the other end. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the things that you've got on the screen now, from customer service, delivery, product management, sales, marketing, HR, all of it plus more were things that we had to work on. So it really starts with the management commitment first. If you don't have the management buy-in, then it's very difficult to drive this throughout your organization, because basically what's happening is that your policies and procedures really need to be aligned company-wide, and everybody needs to really put in the privacy impact assessments throughout their project life cycles, regardless of what the department they're in.
Yeah, cool. So, Jason, I think one of your claims to fame is, you're ISO 27701 certified. You think you're one of the first here in the Asian region. Is that right?
Yeah, so for a company-wide scope, specifically for our industry, we are the first for the fintech, blockchain, crypto space, for the old ISO plus this new ISO plus PCI level 1, we are definitely the first. And also in Asia Pacific, alongside, I believe, you guys and some others like Microsoft, etc. I think there's only a handful that actually have this certification right now. And the word on the street is that there's been some companies that have really tried, but they've put their brakes on it because they realize that they actually have to really kind of put this as a strategic initiative in order to kind of roll it out.
Yeah. So Alex Lee, your counterpart at Microsoft, was a big push for the 27701. They've done a lot of work. They've offered some free tools as well in their space to help you out. And I think the point you make there is really important. One of our large banking customers said to us, the privacy team is kind of pushing discipline into the rest of the organization. And I think as they start to go through this process, they start to understand that, they don't actually understand what they're doing as much as they should be, right? And, in the third party and the vendors there, one implementation we did, they didn't even know where their third parties, like they didn't keep a record of where they were located, which is kind of important in a whole lot of aspects that we don't need to go through. As you mentioned, Jason, OneTrust is ISO 27701 certified. With our experience of that, we're happy to share that with anyone out there. We've also produced this white paper. So reach out to our website or to myself. My email's rrowe@onetrust.com, and we can provide this white paper to help you get started in that. And, you know, we've produced all this work. The other thing that Jason talked about was the fact that there's a lot of people are using GDPR as the basis, right? So what we've also produced here is through our data guidance, which is our regulatory legal knowledge database that you can have access to, is we're starting to compare all the different sort of regulations across the region against GDPR. And we've produced these booklets that you can download where you can say, you know, the first one there is the Australian Privacy Act and Privacy Principles versus GDPR, right? We're seeing, if you want Brazil, but we got China, we got Japan, we got India, CCPA, Thailand, etc. And we're doing more in terms of that comparison between the GDPR and these regulations. And on the platform, by the way, you can actually go in and select which ones do you want to compare. And we drill down with our network of 500 lawyers around the world. We drill down to say, here's where they compare, here's where they differ, and show that evidence as well. So ISO 27701, but also comparison against the GDPR. So what we'd like to encourage you to do is apply what we've been sharing here. Jason is very, you can see him out there on the speaker circuit. He's a big chair of the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Jason and I have been on a panel before together, and so great source of knowledge there to hear about what's going on. He's got more certifications than I ever knew were possible. Have a look at the ISO 27701 program out there. Reach out to us. We can talk to you about that, help you do that, and build this overarching. So this privacy implementation management system, which then think of that multifaceted Rubik's Cube all the time, and then think about, we can then drop that into all the different regulatory frameworks as we go on. So with that, we're nearly out of time, but really like to thank you for participating in this. Like to thank Jason again. Thanks for the help. Always good to talk with you.
Thank you.
And folks, we're here if you ever need any of our help. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.